Good morning. This is a quick video to go through section 3. I'm not sure we're going to get all done in one video. We'll find out. It's kind of a lengthy section. So here we go. In section 3, we're going to talk about the people who aren't the white guys. Most of history covers white male history, and that's because white males write the history books. So they tend to make the white males the heroes, and certainly there were white male heroes in the Revolutionary War. But we're going to take a section real quick and talk about all the rest of the people. One out of the 4 sections. So let's talk about the other groups, the Native Americans, the women, the African Americans that not only helped in the war but were affected by the war. And we'll start with African Americans first. There certainly were thousands and thousands of African Americans living in America, some of them free, but most of them slave. And they had differing opinions on the war itself and which side to join. I remember most people living in America wanted nothing to do with the war, but those who did were not evenly split, but fought on both sides. The war offered opportunity for African Americans to kind of get a step up in status. If they fought for the country, then they deserve to be part of that country. It also represented danger. A lot of African Americans are going to die in the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War is probably the last time. It is the last time that African Americans fight alongside white men in integrated units in American history until we get to World War II. So it's kind of a fascinating war. The North originally didn't want African Americans to fight for them, but by the end they were fighting alongside the white guys. So from the beginning of the war, especially in New England, free African Americans who oftentimes owned property, etc., fought for the colonial army. They were fighting for the same things the white people were. They wanted freedom. They wanted to spend their own money. They didn't want to pay too much taxes, all that stuff. However, enslaved African Americans almost exclusively fought for the British because the British offered them freedom. If you joined the British military, you were set free. Now, the British were still pretty racist. That doesn't change. So you could join the army, but you're going to get minor jobs: cooks, blacksmiths, teamsters. Teamsters are people who move items from one place to another. These are jobs that traditionally slaves did. So even though you joined the British military and you got a British military uniform, you still served kind of as slaves. But if Great Britain had won the war, these men would have been free. However, when Great Britain leaves and abandons the colonies, these people end up back in slavery. So that promise is never realized because it wasn't made by the Americans. Washington, who's from Virginia, owned slaves, did not want African Americans in his army, slave or free, period. But once the British started accepting them, he didn't have a lot of choice. And he's going to start allowing African Americans in the military. And they are going to serve with weapons on the front lines, unlike the British African Americans who are going to be given menial jobs. More than 7,000 African Americans served in the Continental Army. That's a pretty decent number. That's a really high percentage of African Americans that were free. There weren't a lot of them in America. It was not a huge number, and a lot of them did serve in the Army. During the Revolution, especially northern states, New England, the farther away you were from the South, you were more likely to start passing rules that limited slavery. And within a couple years after the end of the war, New England is going to actually end slavery in those states. And they're going to kick anybody who owns a slave out. You can either leave or free your slave. So a lot of people actually sold their slave real quick to somebody in the South to get their money back. It's such a brutal system. But by a couple years after the war, slavery is going to not exist in New England. The closer you get to the South, the more likely slavery is still going to exist. And then, of course, the South is going to keep their slavery until they're forced to get rid of it after the end of the Civil War. In addition to slavery, one of the issues that we're going to have is the Continental Army is going to have a very difficult time keeping numbers. Most men did not want anything to do with the war. Those who did enlist and volunteer to serve in the Continental Army only had to serve 1 year. And that's because we believed in freedom. You can't say, I believe in freedom, and also you must serve in the military forever. So the goal was to get them in the Army and then make them so dedicated to the cause that they'll keep re-upping. They'll keep 1 year, 1 year, 1 year, 1 year, they'll stay in the Army. Unfortunately, as we know, they didn't get paid, they didn't have boots, they were constantly losing. So most of those men left. We lose most of our trained men. They come, they train, they learn how to fight, they go home, and we lose them. We have to start all over every year. That's going to start changing towards the end of the war. But Washington's going to really, really struggle to keep his army around. In addition to the military, civilians themselves had some issues. The British would attack towns that were known to support the Patriots because most of those towns, militia was gone. The militia joined the army. So a lot of these were undefended towns. They would burn down farms known to support the Patriots. They didn't go around killing citizens. They're still British. Remember, the British considered these Patriots their citizens, their people. So they're not going to run around killing everybody, but they will punish them for supporting the Patriot cause. And even if they didn't punish them, the British Army was buying everything. All the food, all the supplies was going to the British Army. So there were shortages of tons and tons of different items. And so the average civilian had a really tough time getting by in these years. Women in the Revolutionary War had to step up and kind of do all the jobs that the men had left behind. This is a picture of Molly Pitcher. She's kind of famously I think she was giving her husband water or something, helping in the war, and then some men died on the cannon, and she started helping the cannon crew and helped firing the cannon. Extreme exception during the Revolutionary War. She's kind of almost a mythical proportion hero. Most women did not, or like hardly any women actually served in combat. But they did help. They not only took over the men's jobs on the farms, and they had no idea what they were doing. They were not trained in any of this stuff. They had the brains for it. They had the heart for it. They didn't have any training, so they didn't know what they were doing, but they still stepped in anyway. I mean, imagine what it takes to take up a job you've never done before and have to feed your kids doing it. So they're going to plant crops. They're going to take care of livestock. They're going to run businesses. And they don't have the know-how to do this, but they just figure it out as they go. They write their husbands and ask them, like, when do I put the crops in the ground? How do I do this? I found this. They draw a picture saying, I found this in the barn. Is this used for what I think it is? And they try and get as much advice from the men, but a lot of the men couldn't read and write. So it was kind of the deaf leading the blind, but they still got the job done. Some other things that helped is they would form circles where the women would kind of get together in town and talk about the stuff that they learned and figure stuff out. Loyalist men helped women on their farms because even if they were helping, even if it was a patriot family, quote unquote, they were still British and they still needed to eat. So loyalist men didn't serve in the British Army. Patriot men did serve in the American Army. So loyalist men would help the women with their farms if they could, if they had time. They didn't have a lot of time, but they managed to get through it. Some women served with the men in the war. They didn't pick up weapons, but they stayed in a camp outside of the army camp and would take care of the wounded, do some cooking and cleaning, fix uniforms, stuff that was traditionally called women's work back then that men had no idea how to do. And they would do a lot of that stuff. So they actively helped the army even if they weren't picking up a weapon. And America owes a very long debt to women. Every time the men go to war, the women have to do everything else. And they have over and over and over again in American history. We would not have won any of our wars, and we've won a lot of wars. We wouldn't have won any of those wars without the help of the women. After the war, women are going to keep a few jobs, but mostly go back to the homes. But we will see a few women opening businesses. They'll keep those social circles alive where they helped each other out. And, 120 years later, we'll actually see that turn into the women's rights movement. It's going to take a while, though. All right, let's talk about money. We didn't have any. The Congress had created these continentals. That's paper money. It's not tied to any coins. It's not tied to any backup by gold or anything like that. It's just paper. And so obviously it's easy to burn. You can drop it in water. It goes away. But the most important thing was it was useless. Congress couldn't tax anybody. So the paper was pretty much just make-believe money. It wasn't actually money earned in any way whatsoever. And if you give out more and more money, it becomes worth less and less. That's called inflation. An issue we're looking at in America pretty soon here, or right now. And it's just going to be useless money. And so these soldiers are going to be walking around with money that nobody wants. And if tomorrow everybody woke up and decided $1 was useless, all of our money would be useless. We couldn't use it. It only works because people want it. And nobody wanted continentals. It's going to eventually change because the British and the Spanish and the Dutch are going to give us money and give us loans of their own actual money. And then we're going to pay the troops with money that's useful. But the continentals were useless. Nobody would take them. So Congress was legitimately broke, which means our soldiers were legitimately broke. All right, let's move out west. Most of the stuff we've been talking about has been in New England, New York, Pennsylvania area. There was some fighting in the West. It was very limited. Again, it's going to be Native American versus Americans. The Native Americans are going to largely join the British, and it's going to go really terrible for them, not on the combat field. But Americans knew that the Native Americans were never going to help them. You know, if you go to these Native American groups and say, look, we really need you to help us defeat the British, and the British go to them and say, look, we really need you to help us defeat the Americans, the Americans knew that the Native Americans were not going to join them because we have been actively slaughtering men, women, and children on the Western Front for years now. But if you go back 15 years in history, the British were doing that too. The only thing that's changed is the Proclamation of 1763. And that's where England said, colonists, go back east, get out of this land is for the Native Americans. So the Native Americans are not going to join us. We make a valiant attempt to get them to remain neutral by trying to pay them off. This is hilarious for a few reasons. First off, Native American groups don't believe in hoarding wealth. So offering them millions of dollars was useless. But secondly, we offered millions of dollars in continentals. Again, nobody wants that. But on top of that, Native Americans trade with the British out here. That's the forts that they use for trading posts. And British people really, really aren't going to take continentals. So this was just a dumb move. And they joined the British. The Native Americans are going to bolster the lines of the British during this war quite a bit. So what fighting happens out there? Mostly happens under a guy named George Rogers Clark. But despite the fighting, or aside from the fighting out west, Native Americans are going to lose a terrible toll during the Revolutionary War. A new strain of smallpox comes with a lot of the soldiers that man these British forts. The British take their soldiers in the forts at the beginning of the war and they move them eastward because they're veterans. We want our veterans to go fight Washington. But they need to keep the forts still manned. So they move their people out of the forts and they replace the people in the forts with 17, 18-year-olds directly out of England. They bring with them a nasty new strain of smallpox, as we're fully aware today. Diseases sometimes mutate. And smallpox wiped out the Native Americans when the Spanish came in the 1600s. About 90% of the Native Americans died. Well, 200 years later, Native Americans have immunity to that version of smallpox, but the new version comes along and it kills 130,000 more Native Americans. Only 30,000 men are going to die during the Revolutionary War in combat, like being shot by muskets. 30,000 men. 130,000 almost exclusively Native Americans. There were a few white people that died that lived out on the frontier as well. So the Native Americans are going to lose 4 to 5 times as many people, not even in combat. And they largely didn't even really want to get involved in this, but they got involved anyway because they get killed by the smallpox. There is no bright shining moment for Native Americans in American history. There's no point at which you say, man, that went well. The government and the Native Americans really figured that out well. There's no good point. And this is another nasty point for the Native Americans. All right, George Rogers Clark. This is an American general. You can tell by his blue uniform with the tan lapel. That's an American general. He's going to take a small group of troops out west, and really he's just supposed to be distracting the British. The British can't lose any forts. They look stupid, right? The rest of the world is looking at them saying, you better not lose to these farmers, these little podunk, colonists. And so if we're running around taking forts, the British look terrible. So they have to defend everything. All of their territory they have to defend. And we figure that out. And we sent a small troop over there to start just attacking British forts and then running away. Attack and run away. Attack and run away. Attack and run away. That way the British have to defend all these forts and send more and more men west. Every soldier sent west is a soldier that can't fight the Continental Army out east. So he goes out there just to really distract the British. And lo and behold, the British's forts are all manned by these 17 and 18-year-old kids. And he starts taking forts. And it's a real shocker. Then the British actually put together a decent army and actually go to chase him down. And he surprises them and wins like a big old open field battle at Vincennes. And this is huge for 2 reasons. First off, this is a post-Valley Forge army that's been trained. And it's better than the British. But secondly, we're going to take an army. And what's going to actually cause the end of the Revolutionary War is that we're holding on to too many British troops. We've taken too many British troops hostage, and they want their troops back. And this is the second army we've taken. We've taken one at Saratoga, and now we take one at Vincennes, and we're going to hold on to those troops. This is one step closer to the end of the war. More to come later.